Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Chief Talent Officer, Tax KPMG, Steve Fortier.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Synergy. I'm Steve Fortier. I am thrilled to be here. As I was sitting backstage kind of reflecting on this time together that we have, I started thinking back about what a crazy, crazy summer it's been in our country. And really thinking about the last few weeks. I mean, it's been unprecedented, the coverage in the press and everything we're hearing on TV. And I realized I just had to come up here and make a comment. That's right. The Chicago Cubs have won the World Series. How about it? Let's hear it for the Cubs. I am from Chicago. I had to throw that out there. So I wanted to talk a little bit this morning. We heard from Joe and Nathan and Andy with some very consistent themes. And I wanted to touch on really set the context for how some of those disruptive changes are impacting the tax function. Talk about what it means for tax, and then think a little bit about what you might do individually, right? How do you take advantage of these changes and make it work for you as opposed to being transformed, as Nathan said? So let me start with the first one. Automation. Most companies have done some level of standardization of process, right? You probably have seen it in your companies. Maybe you've offshored some activities, and maybe you've run Lean Six Sigma and eliminated some processes altogether. The next step in that evolution is really this notion of robotics process automation, right? So taking some of those lower value, repetitive type activities and really having those be done by what are known as bots. And if you don't think this is relevant to your company, you should think about some of the big BPO, business process outsourcing companies in India. They are terrified of this, right? They do IT, they do process outsourcing, and it's estimated that they're going to lose 680,000 jobs in the next 5 years. So everything that's been moved offshore is starting to go away. So think about that and think about the implication for your business. The next one is cognitive computing. So as we move along the continuum from kind of automation into machine learning, into really computers thinking like humans and making judgment calls, this is a real, it moves up the value chain and it's somewhat scary, right? So how does that work? Well, let's take an example in the medical field where systems are ingesting every medical image that a hospital's ever done, all the case notes for how that patient was treated and the outcomes for those patients. That information is fed into a computer and it starts to provide insight into how the doctor might treat the next patient. So you get that next image, you plug it into the computer, it ingests it and it says, well, here's a 70% likelihood that it's this and so forth, and it provides treatment guidelines. The same thing can happen in the tax world, right? We think of what's cognitive in tax. Well, what if you could ingest every piece of case law, every regulation that's there in the US or internationally? Every piece of guidance, every ruling, all the guidelines, different outcomes of cases, different positions companies have taken in their outcome. And all of a sudden, you're building up a huge corpus of information that can be used to really provide greater insight and guidance to tax professionals such as yourselves. So it's coming. Finally, big data. We hear plenty about big data, right? The statistic that 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years, and that within 5 years, we'll have 10 times more data than existed in the whole world through 2013. So a staggering amounts of data. But the interesting thing with this data is that it's not simply X's and O's and numbers. It's really about language and natural language and the ability to tap into that unstructured data. So we'll come back to that in terms of tax as well. And I think of these things, I say, on the one hand, they're terrifying, right? Because it throws a lot of uncertainty into your roles, into your lives, but it also creates a unique opportunity for you to add value in a different way to your organization. So let's talk a little bit about what that might be. First, you're going to need some new skills. You're going to have to be nimble, you're going to have to be open to these changes, and you're going to have to be able to capitalize on them. Things are changing faster than they ever have in our lifetime. Secondly, you're going to have to learn quickly, right? A lot of these trends and changes can be terrifying until you start to delve into them and learn more about them. And I would tell you, learning will look very different. So a lot of us grew up in an environment where you went to a class, you sat in the back, and you might have taken some notes, you might have checked your phone, or you might have nodded off. But it's going to look very different. I would say there's going to be a lot more interactivity, right, with all the digital capabilities we have, the mobile capabilities. You're going to have more gamification of training. You're going to have more video content, right? Those of you who have children out there, you know they're looking online to things like Khan Academy to really to bring that learning in-house. So you're going to learn differently and more quickly. And then finally, you're going to have to be adaptive. We're hearing a lot about different types of technology, but the only thing that's certain is that we don't have all of them identified right now. So we know things are going to change further. You're going to have to be able to adapt to that. So again, consistent with some of those earlier thoughts that we heard from Andy and Nathan and Joe is you really need to become a business advisor. And what does that mean? It means you're going to have to figure out how tax can harness some of these new technologies, right? So talk about robotics, talk about functions and processes that people are currently doing in your department. Every VP of tax or chief tax officer that I talk to says, Steve, I'm under pressure. I've got to do more with less. I mean, I hear that every company I go to, got to do more with less. This is a way you can do that. So you can be part of the solution, right? Figuring out how to use bots to help manage some of these routine functions, or you can be passed by it. Secondly, think about all the power of that data, right? All this big data, and historically you had a lot of numbers, they were trapped in kind of legacy systems, but now you've got context around those numbers. So you've got descriptions of meals and entertainment items, or research and development items, or lobbying expenses, and you can link that data to some of this natural language and start to use it to both analyze your past positions, but more interestingly, think about the predictive power of that. The power to identify areas where you may capture greater planning opportunities or identify risks earlier and help to mitigate those risks. You need to understand your business like the board. And what I mean by that is, your companies are changing. They're adopting to digital, to mobile, to different ways to interacting with customers, different business models, subscription revenue. Think about the value of intellectual property in some of our traditional bricks and mortars companies. They're becoming technology companies. So as your business changes, you need to think like a board member and get out in front of it and think about the tax implications of those changes. Be a strategic advisor to the board in that context. Seek out stretch opportunities. So I had a CTO that told me, he said, Steve, whenever I have someone who gets really good at their job, I move them into a different job. And I kind of gave him a puzzled look. I knew where he was going. I just thought it was a fascinating approach to managing his people, right? He said anybody who's really good at what they're doing is not continuing to learn. So I want to move them out and put somebody in there new. It's a very progressive view in terms of it might have some impacts on efficiency, but in terms of thinking about his people's development, he was pushing them into stretch opportunities. So let me give you 3 final thoughts on this. 1, you're going to need to build out your technology and data skills. It's absolutely critical. We know the technologies are evolving. We know the impact and the power of data is not going anywhere. Secondly, broaden your technical tax and geographic perspectives, right? With the world's getting smaller, technical issues are not going away either. It's the taxologist that can kind of mix the technology side with the deep technical side, as well as the perspective, not just the US perspective, is really going to be invaluable. And finally, I think you should make yourself uncomfortable. If you don't get up every morning and worry a little bit about your job and thinking about what you're going to do, and you don't have those butterflies occasionally, then I would challenge you that you're not pushing yourself hard enough. Make yourself uncomfortable as you move into new roles and grow and continue to develop. So finally, be an advisor who seeks new ways to add value. We heard it earlier, you want to be the strategic advisor. If you sit back and you're waiting for someone to come tap you on your shoulder and ask you about your input on a transaction or get your advice on a certain issue, it's too late. You got to get out there when the decisions are being made by your company. You've got to be invested earlier in those relationships and earlier in that process to make the biggest possible impact. So with that, I hope you have 2.5 great days here at Synergy. I really appreciate your time this morning. and enjoy the conference.